This evening, we will be talking about nonprofits and Aliyah. And we have the really unbelievable privilege of having fantastic professionals with us this evening. Andrea Hendler, Amos Levy, and Vinnie Marilis, who have joined us and will share their stories, their Aliyah, and a bit about what it's like to work in Israel. I'm hoping that you will feel comfortable asking questions. My name is Rachel Berger. I'm the Vice President for Employment for Nefesh B'Nefesh. And we are here this evening to help you figure out your own Aliyah, share our stories of our Aliyah, and feel free, as I said, to just at any point ask questions and let us be in touch with you about how we can inspire you and help you with this part of the journey. So I'm going to start with Andrea. If you could share with us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what it is you're doing now in Israel.
Pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. I guess I'll start at the very beginning. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and grew up in Pikesville, for those of you who might be familiar with the community. And I would say, although I was really brought up in a culturally Jewish environment, Israel was never even for a moment on our radar screen, and nobody in my family of origin had any kind of relationship to Israel, or at least that I was aware of. So it was quite unexpected that I ended up spending my junior year of college studying at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which was my first, and you will hear later, a very formative experience here in Israel. I was studying at the time political science. I have a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Vermont. And all I knew at the time, my, I guess, 18-year-old self knew that I wanted to either go into the Foreign Service or international relations of some sort. And I had taken 2 years of college Hebrew, which in and of itself is its own story that I'll save for later. I knew I desperately wanted to study abroad. Initially thought I was going to study somewhere in France. And as time went on, I figured that the Middle East would actually be a great place to immerse myself for a year of study. And that year was transformational in many ways. And from that moment on, I really felt an intense desire to maintain a connection to Israel, both on a personal and a professional level. I spent the next I think it was two consecutive summers living and volunteering in what was at the time Baltimore's sister city. And I just, again, I was, at this point, 21 years old. I vowed to myself that I would find a way to turn this passion for Israel into some kind of a career. I had no idea what that meant, but I quite literally wanted to find a way to get somebody or some organization to basically pay me to travel back and forth to Israel. It was very naive. But what I did is I enrolled in a joint master's degree program, which at the time was called the Baltimore Institute for Jewish Communal Service, which is actually where I met my colleague Amos on the panel. And I received 2 master's degrees, one in what's called policy sciences or public policy from the University of Maryland, and also a master's in Jewish studies from Baltimore Hebrew University. And again, I just wanted somebody to pay me to fly back and forth to Israel and connect to Israel in any way possible. And this was the means, at least educationally, for me to try to achieve that. So after college and graduate school, I actually spent most of my grown-up or professional life in New York City. Over the first 14 years of my career, my first 4 professional roles actually did involve, in many ways, travel to and from Israel, as well as other Jewish communities around the world, which really seemed to satisfy my kind of ongoing desire to remain deeply connected to Israel and engaged with Israeli life. I was content at the time to express my desire to impact the Israel-diaspora relationship from the diaspora perspective. So I spent my first 6 years in both national and international Jewish communal organizations, at both the Council of Jewish Federations and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. I managed global service initiatives for young adults that were really designed to foster leadership for the international Jewish community. And then I guess I would say, based on sort of a track record, an unanticipated track record of developing a leadership pipeline for the Jewish nonprofit sector, I was then recruited to develop and implement a leadership development initiative for early career professionals at UJA Federation of New York. So my career sort of covered local, national, and international Jewish communal organizations. And then the story takes a turn. So about 11 or 12 years ago, which was almost 20 years to the day from that first experience at Hebrew University, I got this wonderful opportunity to spend another year in Israel, this time as an actual grown up, participating in a fellowship for Jewish educational leaders at the Mandel Leadership Institute in Jerusalem. And at the time, I anticipated that this would be a wonderful opportunity to finally be the one invested in, as opposed to my investing in the leadership development of others. What I didn't anticipate, however, was that, all these years later, 20 years later, I would feel deeply connected to this place kind of all over again. I basically had thought I was over it at that point, but I was wrong. And I really began to question whether it was enough to impact the Israel diaspora relationship from afar. And I guess my answer was ultimately no. I was technically obligated to return to the US as a condition of receiving this fellowship. But after returning, I was really sort of counting down the years until I could take this plunge. And for those 3 years, I actually found myself working for 50 weeks a year just to be able to fund the 2 weeks that I would spend in Israel every summer. And that was literally the way I was sort of thinking about my life at the time. So after coming back from, I guess, what was the third consecutive summer post this fellowship, a light bulb went off in my head, and I just realized that I somehow needed to flip this paradigm so that I was actually living my life in Israel and maintaining a connection to the diaspora. So I made Aliyah from Baltimore about 7 years ago in October of 2013. And, while I certainly left all of my family and lots of friends behind in the US, I really have managed to create a very robust social and spiritual community in southern Jerusalem. Um, just a few words about what I do now, and then obviously afterwards, happy to answer any questions. Since I moved here about 7 years ago, my work actually has been mostly US facing thus far, but my knowledge of the nonprofit sector in both places, both in Israel and in America, and my focus on Israel education specifically, has really allowed me to be a shadchan, a kind of a matchmaker between those two worlds. So since I moved here, I've specialized in really enhancing the leadership capacities of Jewish education students and rabbinical students, as well as Jewish educators, all of whom spend some amount of time here. I've worked for the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where I really taught and mentored and guided these students as they spent their semesters or years studying in Israel. And currently, I actually work for the Jewish Education Project, which is a New York-based nonprofit, and I work for them remotely, where I direct a fellowship for veteran teen educators, which is really intended to transform teen education and engagement. The last thing I will say is, and this was just kind of for fun, but I think it was an interesting opportunity. I took the opportunity of being a new immigrant to retrain as a tour guide. I had an opportunity to get some financial support for that as well. And I always sort of, when I thought about Aliyah, for some reason that I still can't quite figure out, Aliyah and being a tour guide was very much aligned in my head. And so my first job here was about 4 days a week. I had an extra day to sort of do something of interest and for myself. And so I spent 2 years training to be a tour guide. And while it's not my primary source of income, it really gave me a tremendous insight into Israeli history and contemporary society that I am so grateful I had the chance to do. So that's basically my story. I somehow managed to have a very, I think, ambitious dream to get somebody to fund me to do something that I really like doing. And I've managed to do that all these years. And so I'm very happy with the decision. It's not, hasn't been without its challenges, but I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Vinny.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Benny Marilis, and currently I'm the head of coaching at a company called Cosmatch based in Jerusalem. But it was a bit of a journey to get to that particular space where I'm at right now. Um, my family and I made Aliyah. We made Aliyah in the summer of 2014, just at the end of the war. And that was sort of a heady time to sort of make Aliyah and to sort of stay with it and go through with it. And it's been an interesting, I think, ride in some ways for all of us here. It was not necessarily something that was on our personal radar for a very long period of time before we made Aliyah, even though sort of somewhere in the back of our minds it was an idea. We were living a pretty normal and pretty good life in New York on Long Island. My wife and I both had pretty solid paying jobs. Our kids were in schools. We had a lot of friends, a beautiful neighborhood where we were living. And then it sort of creeped up as an idea that we, maybe could consider living somewhere else. And Israel became one of the sort of the players in that conversation as a possible place for where we could live. I had spent a period of time in my career as a rabbi, practicing rabbi as a rabbi of a small shul on Long Island called the Young Israel of North Woodmere. And I taught for a lot of years in a lot of the different day schools around the New York area. At some point, I jokingly call myself a recovering rabbi, and I shifted over into organizational work at some of the larger Jewish organizations in the New York area, the Orthodox Union, the National Council of Young Israel, in a lot of different roles, mostly programmatic and relational, strategic to some degree. And those were all really good opportunities. At some point, I had sort of a gap in my resume, let's say it that way. And the big gap in my resume was I had never actually fundraised formally for an organization. So I was never a director of development. I was never the executive director, although being the rabbi of a shul, and some of you on this webinar might know this, to get paid on a monthly basis as the rabbi of a small shul means you're fundraising the budget every month. So even though I wasn't a formal fundraiser, I was fundraising on a regular basis. So I sort of had to fill the gap. And there was an opportunity at Yeshivat Shalavim to be their head of office in the US. And I started working for Shalavim in New York in the spring of 2013. At some point when the conversation about Aliyah started to be real for us as a family, one of the things that was important for us was that one of the two of us would go to Israel with a job, would really be employed already. It was just something that was like a thing for us. And somehow, by some miracle, the board at Shalavim in New York agreed that it made sense for me to run it from Israel. The cost savings and the explanations and sort of the strategy really made a lot of sense for them at the time. And then for the next 3 years, I ran US Shalavim from the Shalavim campus in Israel, traveling back approximately once a month or so during the course of those few years that I was with them. And then doing the events, really going out to the different donors and all the different places and doing that kind of real one-on-one event, month to month, year to year operational fundraising, and even a capital project and helping to build the dorm project at the yeshiva during that time. I really got what I think is sort of like a PhD in action in fundraising while working for Yeshiva Tel Aviv. When that ended, I decided that it was time for me to start my own little business. I started a small consultancy helping nonprofits with their operations. So sort of looking at sort of the places where they had weaknesses and trying to help them come up with solutions to be a better organization, let's say, in those specific spaces. That worked for a little bit of time, and then ultimately it didn't work, but it led to one of my clients there hiring me to run their office in Jerusalem. I started to run another nonprofit in Jerusalem. So now I was really working with a mixed staff, very Israeli staff and English-speaking staff at the same time, learning the ropes of how to handle and managing the executive functions as a leader in an office here in Israel, which was really different for me. And then really at some point therein, I met up with the CEO of Cosmatch. I met a friend of mine who was going to Cosmatch to work as well, and they brought me along. And for the last 2+ years, I've been coaching nonprofits on their fundraising and particularly on crowdfunding. I'm working with organizations all over the world in really increasing the amount of money that they raise, increasing the audiences that they reach and their donor bases, and at the same time, really re-educating in many cases how they go about fundraising on a week-to-week and month-to-month, year-to-year basis. And so in the 2+ years that I've been at Cause Match, I've worked with about 110 organizations, helping to raise somewhere near $35 million for those organizations from, I think, over 70,000 different donors in those different capacities. So it's been a wild ride. It's really, the place I'm at now and the organizations I work with now, really interesting, project, really different kinds of organizations, really like real good insights into leadership in these different places around the world, really feel that impact. I can tell you the one important factor here is, from my standpoint, I was given, my wife and I really sort of had that conversation about going into sort of Cause Match, which was at the time was like a 3.5-year-old company as a startup, and being in that kind of an environment and making that work for us. So it's really different than being the executive director of an organization, being a rabbi or a teacher in a school, which sort of comes with some of the safety nets that you might expect that they have, and going into this very different environment for me, which, sort of scratched a couple of interesting things for me that were interesting that I really wanted to be a part of. That sort of startup idea here in Israel, still having the opportunity to work with meaningful and impactful and social-based organizations, and really beginning to have impact for those people in those places. Thankfully, beyond that, everyone here, my wife really has a terrific employment situation. It's just really, really great. Thank God that really worked out well. Our children adjusted beautifully to Aliyah in just incredible ways and really doing phenomenally well and doing unbelievable things. And of course, as Andrea said, there were some hiccups along the way, and it wasn't sort of a hockey stick kind of a thing. But 6.5 years, almost 7 years later, I would say we're in a pretty good place right now.
Wow. You made Aliyah and then you pivoted and learned a whole new career.
Yes.
Amos, share your story with us, please.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I really have a deep sense of gratitude for the help that we received from Nefesh B'Nefesh through our process when we were making Aliyah. So happy to help out. I sort of grew up in a typical kind of a Northeast New York area, Jewish kid, went to day school. Did the summer tour in Israel when I was 16, did my gap year at Bar Ilan after high school, went to YU, Yeshiva University after that. I was not terribly religious at the time, but ended up there by hook or crook. And, just always had Israel as sort of a part of my Jewish identity. But I was not like a flag waving kind of guy or anything like that. I was not the kind of person who was showing up at Salute to Israel Day parades or anything like that. And I ended up after college going to grad school in Baltimore. Know Andrea really for many, many years from my start in Baltimore. Got my master's in social work. And it was there that I was kind of introduced to this thing called Jewish communal work and really bought it hook, line, and sinker. Ended up doing a number of things since grad school. One of the most profound was I ended up getting connected to the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, where I now work, and participated in a program called the Jewish Service Corps, where I spent a year in Poland. And that kind of changed a bit of the trajectory of my life. Ended up getting married shortly after that year to my wife, who I met while I was in grad school. She's also a Jewish communal professional. And spent, after we got married, we went out to Cleveland, worked for Hillel for a couple of years. Then we were becoming more observant during that time, ended up quitting our jobs in Cleveland and coming to Israel to study for a couple of years. My oldest was born during that time. Then we moved back to Baltimore. We were there for 7 years. I worked for Hillel again, directing an operation on one of the campuses there, and then moved over to the Jewish Federation in Baltimore after 5 years at Hillel in Baltimore, and became the director of Israel and Overseas at the Baltimore Federation. So it was throughout that whole time, I was staffing birthright trips, a lot coming to Israel pretty regularly as part of my work. And every time that I would come, I'd call up my wife and I'd say, like, what are we doing in America? And she'd say family and jobs. And so I'd come back, and that was sort of the end of that. And then when I was leaving Hillel to go over to the Federation, I was scheduled to staff my last birthright trip. And my parents, silly parents at the time, said, we had 3 kids, and they said, if you want to go away for a week, the 2 of you will watch the kids. And so I said to my wife, I said, I've got this free trip to Israel, staffing a birthright trip. Why don't you come and meet me afterwards? And she said, that's fine, but only on condition that we look at it as a pilot trip. And that kind of took me by surprise a little bit, because we hadn't really talked very seriously about it. But I said, okay, because I figured there's no chance that we're going to go and make Aliyah. So, it's a free trip to Israel with my wife. And we spent the time there asking everybody, convince us. And by the time we were done, my wife was totally convinced, and I was absolutely not. And we spent the next year really struggling, like every week, talking about it. And we were very close with our families. We had good jobs. We were living in Baltimore. Great community, very active in our synagogue. And it seemed like we would be giving up a lot to make that plunge, and we continued to struggle with it. And at a certain point, after about a year of struggling, I said, like, intellectually, I know it's the right thing to do, and emotionally, it's a hard decision to make. And we decided that brains have to trump heart when it comes to something like this. Just because it made sense. It just seemed like it was the right thing to do. So we decided to take the plunge. It was pretty heart-wrenching for us, frankly, to figure out when we were going to tell our parents. At that time, 4 children were their only grandchildren. We're very close with my parents, close with my in-laws. And that was not easy at all to kind of break the news, because like I said, we were not flag waving people. It's not like we were talking about Aliyah all the time. My mother actually stopped talking to me for 3 days when we told them that we were making Aliyah. It's the only time in my life she ever stopped talking to me. And I was working at the Federation at the time, and even just like the planning of it was really complicated, because I was working in a very centralized Jewish Federation, kind of prominent role in the community, and I didn't want to be a lame duck, for like a whole year or anything. So we had to figure out when we were going to tell people. So we didn't even tell our kids until we decided we were going to put our house on the market. And once that became public, then we were going to have to tell everybody. So that was March of 2008. And we made Aliyah in June or July of that year. So we've been here a bit over 13 years now. And looking back on it, it was clearly the best decision we ever made in our lives. It was, and we haven't regretted it from the moment that we made the decision. When I announced that I was making Aliyah, people said to me, "So what do you want to do in Israel?" And I said, "I want to work for the Joint." It was kind of my dream to be able to be associated with that organization. And having worked at the Federation and being the guy giving the Joint money, so I had a number of contacts. And when I came here, I met with people. I did a lot of networking. Thank God I had a variety of different opportunities, but the JDC one panned out. And I came into the fundraising department. Started off, managing donor relationships, federations, foundations, individual donors, and gradually kind of worked my way up, supervising a team. And then about 3 years ago, they offered me the opportunity to direct our human resources operation for our global fundraising team. We're a fundraising team of a little bit over 70 people on 4 continents. And so, in my 40s, I got to learn a new field of human resources. I continue to do fundraising. I'm also doing some other things also, and it's really allowed me to kind of have my hands in a lot of things. For me, it's been kind of a dream job. I've traveled all over the world. I've been to, I think, probably like 20 countries on the job. Cuba, been to Alaska, on just every corner. That's been amazing. Frankly, the whole narrative of making Aliyah and kind of suffering for the Jewish people, that hasn't been our experience at all. Just when you consider day school tuition and healthcare, our financial situation is significantly better here than it would have been had we stayed in Baltimore. That I have no doubt about. And what's even more amazing, I mean, we live in Neve Daniel in Gush Etzion, and fell in love with the community. And my parents and my sister ended up following us, and they live in the neighborhood with us. And I never lived that close to my parents since I lived with them when I was a teenager. And another 5-minute walk from us. I see my kids all the time. We now have 6. And when I think back about like the fights that I had with my wife about why we shouldn't make Aliyah, like I said, we just bought a Dyson vacuum. How can we make Aliyah? The vacuum, it's the best vacuum we ever had, and it won't work there. And I think back on that, and it's kind of crazy, but that's sometimes it's the small things that keep you rooted. And you can actually buy a Dyson vacuum in Israel too. I didn't know that at the time, but it's been an amazing ride. So.
Wow. What a story. And it's amazing that your parents followed you. How soon afterwards did they come?
They came probably about 3 or 4 years afterwards. They started to rent a vacation place in Neve Daniel. They were 3 months here, 3 months there. They were living in Teaneck, and they were going back and forth. They had retired my mother had retired right around when we made Aliyah. And they had been coming and visiting us before then. They would spend 2 or 3 weeks with us at a time, 3 times a year, and which was way more time than I had ever spent with my parents before. And they were living with us, so it was nice. It was sometimes a little too nice, but once they came, and I had explained to them that retirement here would be amazing for them, but it was scary for them also. But once they started renting and going back and forth, and they got to know people in the community, and there's a whole group of retirees, English-speaking retirees here in this community. Also, people who also followed their kids, and they fell in love with it. And then they sold their house in Teaneck and found an apartment here, and it's just been amazing, really amazing.
So, Benny, I'm going to ask you, you told your professional story, and the pivot is really an interesting aspect of it, because many people come and they are afraid of the pivot. And then you were also an entrepreneur in the middle, which is also something that shows a lot of, energy and nerve, to be quite honest. You're making Aliyah and you're opening up your own business and stuff like that. But I want to ask you, how at CauseMatch, how is it working with Israeli clients? If you have Israeli clients, what cultural elements can you address, given your background as a professional who had established himself in the States and then working as executive director, going back and forth, so you're still US based. If you can address the cultural issues that you may have had or met in your work at CauseMatch or your work previously.
Yeah, sure. It's less so at CauseMatch than it was prior to CauseMatch, because at CauseMatch, mostly the work I'm doing is organizations that are English-speaking organizations, either in Israel or, in English-speaking countries. So US, Canada, UK, South Africa, things like that. That's most of my work, because from an ability to really explain and teach that sort of level of specification and expertise on fundraising I'm not there yet, let's say, on the Hebrew side. So thankfully we have guys in my position on the Hebrew side who really can do that for most of the Israel-based Hebrew-speaking clientele. Prior to that, though, there was a period of time when I was interviewing for positions here in Israel, and there is just culturally there are differences. Obviously, language is a major difference, but in terms of the way, at least a couple of years ago, was very much the case. The way people looked at fundraising, viewed fundraising, sort of the level of professionalism vis-a-vis fundraising was not the same, and certainly not as developed as it was in the US. And the opportunities were very different. So coming into the idea that you're going to make a certain salary at a US based organization and then dream that that's going to exist in Israel, was sort of not easy for me to accept that that wasn't exactly the case. And so there was a lot of sort of working through that for myself to really understand, hey, what do they want? What do they need from me? What's like the thing that's interesting to them about me? For the most part, it was that I spoke English and that I had a lot of good contacts back in the US that maybe could be funders and donors to their organization, which I can appreciate. But there was a lot of that. It was really, and then once I was working in one, really understanding the mindset of the people that are on the team and how they work and how they think about work, how they think about their passion for a cause, and how they explain it in their own language, legitimately and literally in their own language, was really an education for me. I learned a ton about sort of the ecosystem of nonprofits in Israel during that 1 year running that one organization, and then the prior year plus sort of working with different organizations, schlepping around the country, meeting organizations, understanding their operational setup, trying to help them implement new software, new programs, new strategies, really just getting to it. So there was like a lot that was an educational piece that I thought I got when I was in the US, which I realized I had for the US, which I didn't exactly have for Israel. Transitioning over to the business side, let's say at CosMatch, then gives me the opportunity to really explain it and really teach it and really understand it. And I can walk into a room and have a conversation with somebody in Hebrew about what they're doing, really understand where they're coming from as an organization, even if I ultimately have to sort of teach back in English to them. So, it's different. The Israel setting than the US setting or wherever a person may be, it's always going to be different. There's going to be cultural shifts that are going to exist. There are going to be, things that just the way things operate are going to be different in certain aspects for sure. The level of the money, the size of the donations, the way donations come in, all that's going to be different. And it's a question of adapting and really being comfortable adapting, being open to adapting to the new environment.
Wow, that is actually a good tip. Andrea, in your work, have you come across any situations that have been really surprising in terms of cultural differences and expectations?
It's interesting. I think in my work settings themselves, there hasn't really been all that much that has been surprising to me. There's some things actually that I can, looking back on it, say I really actually appreciate here, which, for example, just the directness of communication. Having spent almost 20 years in the nonprofit sector in the States, I didn't necessarily experience that same kind of very direct communication. And while it may have taken a couple months to get used to here, I actually really appreciate just sort of knowing what is expected of me and being able to communicate in a very direct manner. I will say, and somebody asked a question about looking for a job, I will say that probably more than anything that has surprised me is the process of looking for a job here in Israel. I've actually, partly because I've been predominantly on the program end of operations as opposed to fundraising, most of the positions that I've had have been grant funded and therefore time limited. And so I've actually looked for jobs, at least I think I'm now on my third round of looking for a new position. And that process I have found to be different culturally. So just as an example, position that I applied for last week, got very positive feedback from the person from the staffing company that's running the search, interested in setting up a meeting with me with the CEO of the organization. And before I even got to the point of sitting in the CEO's office and determining whether there was actually a fit between the job description and what I think I have to offer, there was a conversation with the staffing company about my salary expectations. It was right off the bat, without any conversation about whatever I might in theory be able to contribute to the organization. And at that point, the conversation basically ended. And in the US, there would have been I think there would have been an opportunity to sort of finesse that a little bit more and to get myself in the door of the conference room or in the door of the office in such a way that I could prove my value. And then there would have potentially, I mean, who knows, but my sense is from experience in the States, there would have been a potential to sort of up the ante a little bit and potentially get closer to my salary expectations. So that's just one example. And it's not better, it's not worse, it's just really different than what I experienced in the States.
Look, as someone who's worked in staffing and helping people, find jobs over the past 20 years, I feel for the cultural difference, meaning it's almost like it's a little bit of a shook in the sense that the company does not want you to go to a place where you would be offered less, even if you would accept their offer, but they feel that you might feel insulted, so they're not interested in giving you something that you don't want. And you should be the one to name the price, and then they tell you to fit. You know what I mean? It's almost like oranges. They're 5 shekels a kilo. I was really only going to pay 4, And it's a very hard, I speak to so many HR people. It's really hard to change that. But that allows me to ask you, Amos, as an HR person, if you can address 2 things. One, the point that Andrea had raised about the differences in hiring practices here, but for yourself, any cultural differences with the people that you're working with at the joint? Are they mostly American or Anglos, or are you also working in a multicultural environment?
So I'll answer the first one first and the second one. So in terms of differences in hiring practices, I haven't really seen it much at the joint. I mean, we run like an American organization, even though our headquarters is in New York, but our largest area of staffing is here in Israel, about 500 employees here in Israel. But certainly within the nonprofit sector in Israel, there's a wide range, and there's a lot more things are just kind of casual. People know each other. When you come in as an immigrant, you're coming into a society where people are just much more deeply connected. It's a much more incestuous kind of environment here than what I was used to in the States. And as an immigrant, you're kind of out of that a little bit if you haven't served in the Army. There's certain things that are kind of missing from your resume, and you need to be able to adjust to that. And I think that also the nonprofit scene in Israel is huge. And I think that a number of nonprofits are run by founders, that they're small operations. They want them to be bigger. They see an American and they think, oh, you're going to go ask money from your rich relatives. And they want to hire you as a director of development. And they tell you, you need to raise, we need you to raise $200,000. And then you come into the job and they say, well, we looked at the books. We actually need you to raise $400,000. And if you don't raise $50,000, now we're not going to be able to make payroll. So there's sort of a lot of that kind of flying by the seat of their pants. I think Israeli society thrives on flying by the seat of their pants in general. So that's different for sure. And in terms of cultural differences, the department that I'm in, because we're a fundraising department and most of our donors are in English-speaking countries, so almost the entire department in Israel, they're almost all Anglos, almost all English speakers. But the rest of the folks that I work with, my colleagues in the building, those other 450 employees, they're almost all either native or Hebrew or Russian speakers, but most of those conversations are in Hebrew. The cultural differences are a few. There's, Israeli society is there's a bit more of machismo than what I was used to in sort of the American Jewish nonprofit sector. Again, the Army thing. What I found, my Hebrew was okay. My Hebrew's definitely gotten a lot better. The kinds of things that have been difficult for me, some of it was just my own baggage, my own self-consciousness about being the immigrant. And some of it was also just like, I'm very comfortable communicating. It's my job. And to like join a hallway conversation that's happening in Hebrew, for me was that kind of casual thing where there's just these casual nuances, cultural references that I don't pick up on, phrases, expressions and things like that, abbreviations from the Army, all those kinds of things I'm missing. And so you have to just kind of accept it with humility and just get past it, because most of it is my issue. It's not other people's. And I had to kind of learn that too.
Wow. That's amazing. The truth is, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, yeah, but then his kids are going to go to the Army and then he'll know every, different abbreviation that exists.
My oldest is serving now, and I'm learning through her, and she, I often don't understand 20% of whatever sentence she's saying when she's speaking English to me, but I get her to translate and be my cultural liaison.
It's okay. I'm sending my youngest off to the Army soon, and then I think I'm at the point where I can hold. I can understand it. Okay, so we're coming to the conclusion. I would like it if everybody can think of a tip or a message to give to our listeners, just about your world in terms of working here in the nonprofits and impact. And Andrea, if it's okay, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. It's interesting. I just participated in a webinar just before this panel, and on a topic completely unrelated, but there was one thing that stuck with me from that webinar. And it was basically, it had absolutely nothing to do with the Israeli cultural context, but the person who was basically delivering the message said, no is the beginning of the conversation. It's not the end of the conversation. And I feel like, when I think back on the last probably 8 years from when I made the decision to come on Aliyah and began thinking about what kind of job I would ultimately seek, and the multiple job search processes that I've gone through since, I think what I've learned is just that again, another cultural frame in Israeli society, in anything, whether you're talking to a bus driver, a doctor, or somebody that you're seeking employment from, is often that really no is actually the beginning of the conversation. And it took my North American cultural brain several years to really understand that, and probably several more to sort of internalize that. So that's probably one of the best pieces of advice that I can give is, no is an opportunity to actually explore more deeply and further what it is that potential organization is actually looking for from a potential employer. And that in and of itself, that learning is actually very valuable. So I'm taking that with me now as I look for my next opportunity, that no is just the beginning of a conversation. And I guess the other thing relates to what Amos said earlier, which is just that society here, I thought society in New York City was pretty incestuous in the Jewish community, or in Baltimore, but I have learned through experience that here almost everything is communicated via word of mouth, and it's, your neighbors, mother-in-laws, best friends, daughters, whatever, like that's just the way it is. And so if you're thinking seriously about making Aliyah, like Benny said early on, some of his earliest contacts were based on people that he knew already. And my guess is that, many of the people that are on this webinar know people here, or know people in the States who know people here. And so I think I'm constantly networking, even when I'm not looking for a job. Almost every conversation I have, I look at as a potential networking conversation. Even it's not about jobs, but it's about potentially new relationships, new connections, and the help is always two ways. So that's the other piece of advice, is just network.
Amazing. Thank you. Benny.
Yeah, that was along the same lines. I wanted to share two things here. One, I really think it's important to sort of keep that idealism up. There are moments when it's not easy in terms of just the path towards Aliyah, and to sort of have that why that you really want to be here is really important to keep it, because it'll allow you to get through some of the tougher moments. But I would share a couple of things. One of that networking thing, a super important point that Angie just brought up. And in the course of being here, and it's not in my comfort zone per se, to go have coffee with people and to sit and schmooze with them. I'm much more like practical and result oriented in that way. But once I'm in the conversation, it's fine. And there was a gentleman I met about 3 or 4 years ago who said, just go have like 50 coffees with people. I'm like, that is just not something I'm going to do. And he said, just try, open up, be open to the idea of going and meeting people, because you think you know people here, but the person you need to know might be 1 or just 2 steps away from the person that you know, and just go start talking to people in that way. And so I looked at both interviews and coffees as opportunities to expand what I thought was a pretty good network into a much more powerful, more robust network that I have right now. So that was really an important to sort of roll with that a little bit and to be open to it. I think being open to asking for some help here along these lines. We all went through it on some level. And so we're able to be available to a lot of people coming in to really have those conversations with people. I know recently just 3 or 4 different people reached out about potentially making Aliyah. They were in, they're in education or organizational life in the US, talk to me about how this works. And being open to that conversation and asking is a really, really significant piece of it. The second part I would say is, related to that last point, is to be open to different kinds of opportunities and to not stay rigid to a specific role or a specific task that you're particularly good at or like you think you're really good at. Just to be open to what could be another opportunity. Again, by having that conversation, by really sort of, exploring it, sort of scratching the surface a little bit to see what that is, and to be open to different kinds of opportunities. So I started out as a rabbi and as a teacher in schools. I'm still teaching to some degree now, but it's a different kind of teaching with a different kind of audience, a different kind of student. And for me, it still works because the bigger thing for me always was impact. How do I have impact? Where do I have impact? What ways can I have impact? I'm always thinking about impact. And so by making organizations better, by making people better, by making leaders better, I'm having, in reality, global impact. So it's like different than the impact I thought I was going to have by teaching, Bible or Talmud in the high school, which is where I started, or giving speeches from a pulpit in synagogues in the United States. But it's still very fulfilling. And I think a lot of it is, one, I have really good support, for sure. That's a factor for me. My wife and children, my family, very supportive of some of the crazier things they've tried to do, starting that business and all those other things. But at the same time, learning to be sort of open-minded to the opportunities that are out there, and to really think about this. As much as Israel, I think on some cases, is very rigid about the job description and what they're looking for, I find that once you are in the room and starting to scratch the surface on the conversation about the role, about what they're looking for, but what else you can offer to them, that things start to sort of begin to open up. So I think those are really 2 important things: that adaptability and network piece, and 2, the adaptability vis-a-vis what it is that you're trying to do, what it is you really want to do, and where it is that you want to do it from.
Well, that's amazing. That is really amazing. Thank you so much. Amos, some words of wisdom for our audience.
Sure, I very much connected with what Benny just said. I think it's flexibility is key. One of the things that I've seen, and I've seen this also in terms of my wife's career here, that there are a lot of nonprofits who are receiving grants from various foundations and federations in North America and elsewhere, and the demands of the donor market in terms of reporting and writing just keeps going up in terms of what they expect around large grants, at $5,000, $10,000 and above. And there's a huge demand from what I've seen for people who can write well to donors, to write in good native English, to be able to get into the head of the donor, to be able to tell the story in a way that's going to be compelling to the donor. it seems to me that there just aren't enough people here who can do that and do it well. What we found in our own life, again, speaking particularly about my wife, but I see it also at the joint, that it can provide kind of a smooth landing also in terms of the opportunity to do freelance work, to be able to kind of get your foot in the door with different kinds of organizations to do that kind of work. And I'd say just, be open. I think that having 50 coffees with people is a fantastic idea. You get people to become your partner in thinking about what's out there. And from my perspective as somebody who's hiring people, their past experiences is clearly important, but also what skills they have and they bring to the table is really important. And so if you're able to present yourself not only based on your experience, but based on what your skills are and how they are transferable, I think that there are going to be a number of people who are open to hearing that as well in different kinds of nonprofit settings.
Wow, that's also amazing. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us. Again, all our listeners, we have everyone's email on the chat. Feel free to reach out. Everyone would be very happy to help you, to answer you, to have coffee with you virtually. I found this evening truly inspiring, and I thank you so, so much for spending time with us and sharing your stories. And you should have an awesome evening and a great Pesach. Chag Sameach to all our listeners.
Good luck to all of you.
Rachel. Thank you, Nevis
Thank
Benefits.
you.
Thank you.